in this episode.
Take something like disappointment or loss or failure or joy, euphoria. These emotions are very, very different things for a Stoic or for a Nietzschean or for an anarchist or for a kind of Schopenhauerian pessimist. These emotional experiences are very different. So my argument is that, in fact, with Merleau-Ponty, yes, you can argue that emotion contributes to reason, of course, but the extension, my argument is that reason also retroactively affects emotion. Rational frameworks and systems and rational conclusions themselves will reformulate the emotional premise in which they emerge. In the same way that if I have reasoned my way into a position of nihilism or kind of naive spiritual optimism, then the news that my dog has passed away will be registered very differently. Even the emotional experience will be a different experience. And this is my argument, that he does the right thing, Damasio and Malibu, by entertaining this split between rationality and emotion needs to be undone. Emotion contributes to rationality. If you lose emotional processing, you, by extension, lose the ability to reason. But my argument is that it needs to be taken much further than that. And what the important argument is that reason itself affects emotion, not just emotion affects reason.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the psychoanalytic and German idealist philosopher, Dr. Rafael Holmberg. The relationship between philosophy and neuroscience is profound and tendentious, where one has to attempt to bring both of these fields into dialogue without dissolving them into each other. Rafael's work, which broadly draws on post-war cognitive philosophy, German idealism, Marxism, and philosophical psychology and neuroscience, is well suited for this project. And in this episode, we discuss neuropsychoanalysis and the work of Mark Soames, Catherine Malibu's acute philosophizing of neuroplasticity, Lacanian views on the unconscious, and the relationship between philosophy of mind and the brain sciences, all the while thinking contradiction as the German idealists unequivocally do it best. I'm glad to have come across Rafael through Substack, and I highly recommend his publication, Antagonisms of the Everyday, for some of the most penetrating contemporary philosophical writings. And now, a quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you gonna get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. Well, Rafael, as I was saying, thanks a lot for being here, man. Or should I be saying Dr. Hollandberg,
Yes,
given
indeed.
you just got your PhD, right? So congratulations on that. How was that? How did it go defending your thesis?
It was a very strange experience. I thought it was I sat down for it, stressed and very nervous, and then they immediately told me that I'd passed, and that we'd be having a conversation about it, which I thought would give me some sense of release, but it only set me more on edge, because I assumed, like, they were like, "Oh, don't worry about your answers now. Like, you've passed. We're just chatting about it." But I thought, I'm sure you can retroactively revoke that pass if I now answer absolutely terribly. Like, if I now answer, "Oh, I don't know, whatever. I don't care about the thesis," I'm then sure you're well within your right to say, "Actually, I know we passed you, but now we're going to undo it. So I'd have preferred a kind of semblance of a tribunal that might not give me my that might not award it. I don't know if it was a
The
cruel trick.
retroactive anxiety is it's your fault for reading Hegel. That's the
Yeah,
thing.
exactly, exactly. And then, but it's
But no,
always
that's
a nice way of
great.
saying like, we'll, we're just going to be nice and talkative about it. It's conversational. You've passed, but then they can really drive home with the points of disagreement.
Indeed. Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I've never defended my thesis or anything like that, but I've been to other people's PhD defenses, and it's very interesting. It's quite an experience, and hopefully one day in life I can experience that too. Yeah. Well, again, congratulations. That's fantastic. But I guess today we were gonna discuss this relationship between German idealism and neuroscience, or like how these two ostensibly separate fields, one a scientific one deeply metaphysical and deeply philosophical, how we can bring them into dialogue and sort of see what that'll produce, let's say. But since this is your first time on the podcast, as if I may, as a bit of an introductory note, perhaps you could start on a bit of a biographical note and just talk about, as a philosopher interested in German idealism, Marxism, psychoanalysis, what also got you interested in philosophizing neuroscience?
Well, I think it's always I think philosophers are always the worst at talking about themselves. They're great at talking about other people. So it's always a strange, to reflect. We have this joke. I used to run a kind of semi-heretical reading group in London. And we always used to avoid the question, what would the philosopher think about their own work? Because soon you go down the line, you begin and you ask the question, why did why did Freud invent the death drive? There's all of these kind of bullshit speculations, especially in British psychoanalysis, that he did so to process the trauma of the Great War or the First World War, which is a terrible, terrible argument, because I said eventually you say something, you're going to go down the road of Kant wrote the first critique because his father never loved him or something, so but I can try to give an answer for why I to reflect on my own motivations for I think it started when I was reading a few papers on it here and there. They came up maybe somewhere, and I thought, no, there's some interesting kind of strange paradoxes here that it seems neuroscientists are happy to kind of brush under the rug or say, this is just an advancement in general rational, scientific, empirical inquiry. And I often felt no, this is a direct break. This is a new direction. And then specifically, I think, having been in a lot of psychoanalytic circles, I then and with the rise of neuropsychoanalysis and its sort of vulgar avatars, I thought, no, I have to intervene here. Some pushback is required here, and that made me. The more I read about neuroscience, the more I said, the true kind of accomplice here it should be the great thinkers of paradox, which for me are the German idealists and Lacan and Laplanche to an extent, and some forms of French psychoanalytic theorists and other people as well. But what was being done in neuroscience, it viewed itself in this kind of naive Enlightenment way of we're slowly progressing towards a better empirical understanding of the brain and its relationship to the mind and to consciousness. And they were kind of obscuring the fact that there was, serious.
Sorry, Rafael, I feel terrible to interrupt you, man. The echo is back, and I really feel like this is gonna cause an issue for us. It just came back okay. Before this, I should mention that in the part that we jettisoned, we were talking about your PhD, and I said I should probably be calling you Dr. Holmberg now. And so, yeah, for the listeners, Rafael just got his PhD. Congratulations, mate. Would you want to repeat what you said for the second time? I'm sorry to make you do this,
yes.
but regarding your PhD defense. Yes,
Yeah.
please. There you go. It's a bit Hegelian too. So yes.
Yeah. Yes. No. So it was a sort of strange situation. I sat down for the so-called defense, but I was told immediately that I'd passed and that we would be having a conversation about it, uh, which I thought was like a trick because I imagined, oh my, like what they're really going to do is then like lower my kind of guards, and then if I then start answering like a complete idiot, they'll then retroactively revoke the automatic pass that they gave me. So like I thought if I now sit down and say, oh, I don't know, I don't even really believe in this, it's nonsense, I don't know anything about these people, would they then still go, productive conversation, you get your pass, I'd have preferred some type of semblance of this being like a, like I said, like a tribunal or something, like some element of like I need to defend myself, but they drop the kind of defense mechanism and then can attack you from like a open position. But apart from that, I clearly didn't embarrass myself enough for them to revoke it, which is good, I guess.
Yeah, and you got through it. And as I was saying before, it's your fault for having this retroactive anxiety because of your reading of Hegel. But still,
Exactly.
it was still worth it. Fantastic. So again, to repeat my previous question, this is a bit artificial, I know. I apologize. It is.
No,
I
I
was
prefer
asking you
this method of
before
doing it.
this. Yeah, correct.
It's like a
I
trial
was
run
asking
and
you.
then repeat everything.
There you go. Yeah. And normally it's in the repetition, something new comes out.
Exactly.
But yeah, so as a philosopher working in, well, I should also mention, I said, given this is your first time on the podcast, if I may, on a bit of an introductory note or a biographical note, as a philosopher working in German Idealism, psychoanalysis, Marxism, even as a, for sure, a political philosopher, what really got you interested in philosophizing neuroscience?
Well, here's my original answer, unrehearsed, which is that I'm always suspicious of philosophers trying to give reasons, like personal reasons for their philosophy. As I said, I used to host a reading group in London, which was very problematic. But we used to have this like one principle, which is that we never ask, like biography is not allowed, basically, like because there's this tendency, you saw it most naively with Freud, which was that when Freud invented discovered, whatever, wrote on the death drive in 1920, people were very quick to say things like, I wonder, especially in British psychoanalysis, it was very quick, and they started saying, what led Freud to do this? It must have been the trauma and trying to process the horrors of the First World War. Not that it could have been a theoretical, construction. And I said, it becomes so ridiculous that in the end you could ask, why did Kant write the first critique? Well, maybe his father didn't love him or something. It easily becomes a. So I'm generally afraid almost of biography interfering with theory. So I'm very bad at like reflecting on what reasons I have for what I do. But from a more, maybe my mother never loved me enough, so I wanted to know the neuroscience of love or something. But no, but the real reason, I think at least, was that I became interested in part through neuropsychoanalysis, which was being taught and discussed a lot in my department, here and there. And I thought, a lot of it I was just totally disagreeing with. Like I thought the intention of seeing in the kind of methods of psychoanalysis something that could be have an affinity with neuroscience, but I thought that the true sort of faithful accomplice to the strange paradoxes that neuroscience unearths, because a lot of neuroscientists, I think, have this like naive enlightenment view of what they're doing, which is that we're slowly building up to a better and better understanding of the functioning of the brain, its relation to consciousness, to the mind, etc. But it's clear to me when I started reading about it that this isn't the case at all. These strange cuts, these gaps, these qualitative shifts where even the basic coordinates in which questions are asked on how the frontal lobe functions are totally reworked with the next hypothesis, but they're acting as if it's a continuity. So I said, the faithful accomplice here needs to neuroscience here needs to be thinkers of contingency, of paradox, of contradiction. To me, this is the German idealists and specifically the French psychoanalysts. And I think this is why I became interested in it. And of course, figures like, Althusser and some of the kind of post-war political theorists, but that would be a different, Althusser and neuroscience that's one for the future. Right now, I think German idealism and psychoanalysis need to be explored in relation to it in a different way. But this is what got me interested. It was reading it and disagreeing, I guess you could say.
So, I'm sure you've heard Zizek mention this, but I've even read Catherine Malabou write about this in a few of her writings. This notion that in the, if I may just guess here, let's say past 50, 60 years, maybe post-World War II, there really was what I would call it is a deflation of philosophy when it comes to asking questions about the mind, about the brain even, to a certain extent, or this notion of subjectivity, to use a philosophical term. And what took its place really was something like neuroscience or cognitive psychology. And so if you could sort of, I know that this is not really something that you probably care for much, but just if you could speculate here, why do you think, when it comes to understanding the mind, that it seems in modernity at least, or perhaps post-World War II, as I mentioned, there's this where to ask about these questions of human freedom and consciousness, people, and most of us go to science or neuroscience or cognitive psychology and kind of think that, philosophy and metaphysics, that's just armchair speculations. Why is this ideology of our time that science can tell us more about the mind than someone like a Kant or a Hegel or a Descartes, for that matter?
That's a good question. I think for the most part, I think the very easy answer would be something like, people. If there's one thing we do well, it's obscure our own discoveries. We're terrible at being. If there's one thing Badiou recognize with the the sujet réactionnaire and the sujet obscurantiste, the obscurantist and the reactionary subject, it's that the most normal reaction to a great discovery is to totally vulgarize it. That's what we do well. I think that, of course, Christoph Schuringer, just wrote this book, Social History of Analytic Philosophy.
Absolutely,
and I think,
excellent book.
Yes, and I think the conclusion can be taken even further. I don't think it's just analytic philosophy. I think the trend of empiricism, scientism, are just as much the kind of the aftermath of a genuine dominant, like, hegemonic fear and establishment fear of the question of something like the speculative metaphysical question of freedom, which is contingent to Continental philosophy, therefore to Marxism, therefore anti-corporate ideology, etc. And it was just, there was this kind of trickle-down effect of the two. There's even Michael Hart and Antonio Negri argue that Hegel is still a kind of the ease with which Hegel was assimilated to European politics still shows that European politics was inherently metaphysical, and I think this had to be somehow repressed. I think neuroscience. You get Steven Pinker on your talk show. You've got a much more digestible message than someone who is arguing that we need to fundamentally rethink the basic premises of the kind of empiricist revolution of empirical psychology, neuroscience, according to Continental, German Idealist, even possibly Marxist lines. I don't think, this is partially unacceptable on an establishment level. Um, and I think it's a convenient trade-off, a convenient sleight of hand almost. We focus on neuroscience, the brain, 8 tricks to make you a better learner, whatever, the latest Penguin book on how to, avoid scrolling on TikTok, rather than seriously confronting the basic kind of modes of thought in which something like neuroscience arises. So I think it was just, I think on the one hand, yes, people are generally on some level, like stupid on this level of they just totally undo their own discoveries. But also I think there was a greater, probably the after effect of a kind of generalized ideological push away from continental philosophy.
Yeah, it's funny you use the term continental philosophy because that itself was initially almost like a way that analytic philosophers marginalized a certain way of thinking or ostracized a certain way of thinking by camping all of these people in one, or putting all of these camping people in one camp. And there's a lot to say there. However, what if I devil's advocate a bit here? And the reason I'm doing this is, again, because of going back to Catherine Malabou, because I was reading an interview of hers, and in the interview, I think she does mention that it seems like the case that, yeah, even philosophers are partially at fault here, and not just the analytic philosophers. I'm so glad you mentioned Christoph Schrödinger. I think that's how it's pronounced. That excellent. I'm still getting through it. Social history of analytic philosophy, and just to give it a context, the idea is that this apparently apolitical philosophical movement is, in fact, as we would have all guessed, deeply political and deeply ideological. But what I would say is, going back to the previous question, so even someone like Malabou would say, yeah, even philosophers themselves haven't paid attention to the findings in neuroscience and findings in, let's say, more of like a scientific psychology. Now, I want to ask you this. First of all, do you agree with her? Do you think this is a fair characterization? But also, and I'm not even sure if this is a valid question, but do you think, sort of like what Malabou is trying to do with her project of plasticity, that the findings from neuroscience can inform philosophers working, especially in the German idealist tradition, can inform them what a subject is, or can give us insights into subjectivity?
Yeah, yes. I mean, to answer the first question, I think she's complete. I totally agree that we've, like modern empiricist scientism and things, may be somewhat of an avatar of an enemy. It might be the reproduction of the tool of dominant, ideological structures, whatever. But that doesn't mean you don't engage with it. Like to draw it to a to the very extreme, we should still read Mein Kampf, if you know what I mean. Like, I'm not comparing empiricism to Nazism, but you see what I mean. Like, we should still like, even if it's the outcome of repression or oppression, whatever, we should still engage with it. And I'm not totally discrediting. I think the field of neuroscience is fantastic. I think what they're discovering is incredible. But going back to why is it more popular, blah blah, in the same vein as the social history of analytic philosophy, you still read it. You still read in the way, in the same extreme. We should still read fascist literature. We should still read Mein Kampf. We should still understand the worst possible, the enemy as such. Not that neuroscience is the enemy in this sense, but you see what I mean. So yes, I think philosophers very easily go into a certain arrogance and say we don't need this. What we're doing is because, ironically, when continental philosophers say something like, we don't need all of that nonsense. We know how to ask the real questions. What they're in fact reproducing is the analytic argument of like, we don't need to historicize things, we don't need to politicize things, we just need like pure logical or higher order propositions, etc., which are eternally valid. So yes, the task, and this is Hegel's basic insight, the task of the philosopher is to recognize that the concept is like there's nothing outside the realm of the concept, and in this sense, you should absolutely engage in science. And I think Malibu is completely right in arguing that philosophers have done a very bad job in remaining faithful to it. Regarding destructive plasticity, yes, I think that it borders on this tendency to be a bit like the way that Adorno does, like a broad sweep and says, well, Kant and Hegel, despite their kind of speculative ontological differences, are nonetheless, to a certain extent, thinkers of identity, and identity is what led to totalitarianism and fascism. Therefore, we need a pure, like, dialectics of unassimilable negativity. And in the beginning of destructive plasticity, this is kind of, she doesn't mention Adorno, but she says, what about when there isn't this inherent teleology to destructiveness or to negativity? Like what about when it's purely annihilating? Like there's no greater synthesis around the corner or something. Interestingly, and I think that there's something to it, and I think in part it comes. She opts for Antonio Damasio and Spinoza. Interestingly, in her kind of reading of it, and Spinoza, of course, I think is a wonderful thinker. Damasio has this fantastic thesis that like the opposition between reason and emotion it's not a good opposition, which I completely agree with. Although I don't think he takes it far enough. But the strange point is that she therefore seems to, although she's very Hegelian in a certain sense, or wants to find the new avenues of Hegel, like to purge negation of the inherently not constructive but like substantial dimension of negation. Like there's always a something to nothing in a certain sense for Hegel. There's always the like the disruption it causes within the continuity of being, and in so doing reformulates being as presupposing the very thing that it cannot assimilate. In this sense, nothing, you have to admit a certain substantiality to nothing and to negation. And I don't know if she even takes the argument that seriously, that you think destructiveness in its pure form, because it's very clear that that she is thinking something very different. Like halfway through, when she talks about death, kind of towards the end of destructive, the ontology of the accident, and she says, death isn't, on the one hand, death is a natural progression, like it's a tendency of being towards its own end. And yet when it happens, this natural teleology, in the instance of it, like undoes itself completely. It's suddenly this experimental, excessive self-annihilation that can't be pre-programmed. Like we can know in some abstract form we will die, we live in the Heideggerian sense towards our unassimilable end, and yet death as such in its instance is this almost pathetic, uncalculable expression of being, which is inventing, as she says, inventing its own end. So death, like every single death in a certain sense, is a, how would you say, like qualitatively unique. Like there's no two deaths that are similar. And in my opinion, I mean, here you're bordering on Lacan. You're bordering on like death exists to affirm itself retroactively. Like it wasn't possible the first time, you have to die twice. And then I think even she would realize that like this pure Adorno style mimicry of a pure destructive negativity isn't really what she wants to do. And I think if you take it in this one, you kind of play with it, then I think, yeah, you can easily assimilate her to, and I think there, in that sense, her use of neuroscience is in relation to psychoanalysis is worthwhile. It's very good, but like at a kind of speculative remove, if you see what I mean. Like, but yes, I do like Catherine Malabou very much. Yeah, in
No,
that sense.
that's fantastic. But Rafael, I think it's worth mentioning here. So, in fact, I want to talk to have Professor Malabou on the podcast next year. I've just really got to prepare a lot, including read her book on Hegel, which is going to be quite the project for me, for my little puny brain. But no pun intended. But I think it's important to kind of, because I foresee a lot of the listeners of the podcast aren't going to be familiar with how a philosopher like Malabou is utilizing neuroscience. If you could put it in a very like introductory way, how do you understand Malabou's use of neuroscience to do a philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, what I can do is like maybe go to Damasio, which
Yes,
is
please.
her like
Yeah.
principal reference here. Uh, and Damasio is a wonderful. Like, I know I'm skeptical of him and things, but he is, of course, a very good thinker. The basic argument is that like that what he calls in a very famous book Descartes' error, which is to split not only like the mind-body dualism, but more specifically to assume that there's something like a divine rationality, a kind of metaphysical mind that is the seat of rationality, and then the animalistic element of like emotions, of sensibility, of these things. Banging your leg against a table and like shouting out in pain. There's nothing like mind, like in relation to the mind here, is the kind of Cartesian argument. It's just a kind of mechanistic emotional reaction to a sense stimulus. And what we have on the other hand, like on the other field, is rationality. And the argument of Antonio Damasio is that this has been the tendency that not only like since Descartes, even though Descartes was overcome, modern science kind of revived and somehow unintentionally had a fidelity to this division between emotion and rationality. But what in almost like, and he doesn't admit it, but there's almost a Nietzschean logic to it. But Antonio Damasio's argument is that, in fact, I mean, the basic argument is that without emotion, rationality itself becomes impossible. That's the basic argument.
Can I interrupt for a bit? When you say rationality, at least within the context of this, is that also synonymous to reason? Because your Substack piece, it's reason against emotion. So when you mean rationality, you also mean reason. Is that correct for me to assume?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, yeah, it is in this context. Yes, yeah, it's
in this context. Yes, correct. I know there's a lot more to get into the concept of reason for sure. Yeah.
But yes. So the point is that if you don't have like emotional markers, you can't reason about information properly. And the argument is, for example, if you are going to engage in some type of like sophisticated social or external like maneuver, trying to figure out what to do, the best option, and you have to reason about it. You have to weigh up options, etc. Damasio's argument is that here, if you lose emotion, like if you lose the capacity to register emotion, your own emotion, like not even the emotion of like your own emotion, you then lose the what appeared as the opposed function, which is reason, cold, sober, logical calculation. You lose that as well. And Damasio invents the famous somatic marker hypothesis, which because there's an interesting Nietzschean color to this, because Nietzsche makes this very strange argument in the will to power, like the collected notebooks after the ones that were collected after his death, and then kind of for a period of time vulgarized by his sister, or made more fascistic by his sister. But he makes the argument there that there's always a question with Nietzsche's will to power: is it like a basic biological function, or is it is it an excessively human or superhuman capacity to dominate or to create beyond the boundaries of preconceived of kind of preconceived forms, etc. Is it either like hyperhuman, or is it the basic ground for biology and nature? But he makes this very strange argument where he says, no, the will to power begins with logic. The will to power begins with our capacity to make a logical equation between two things that would otherwise, like, you wouldn't think of a trade or an exchange beyond a certain will which imposes an equivalence between two things, whether it's that 3 of this commodity and 4 of that commodity are in fact worth about the same. Nietzsche's argument is that this drive to subjectively impose your own will, your own emotional experience onto things is where logic comes from. So there's this, ironically, Nietzschean color to Damasio, although I don't think he'd like hearing that. But so yes, this is where Catherine Malabou's use of neuroscience comes from. Like specifically, it's her reading of Damasio, and what she argues is that he's therefore Spinozan, because Spinoza was the first philosopher to recognize that the body is absolutely crucial in substance. Like the body, even in like his ethics, in the construction of an ethical ontological, Deleuze's famous argument that Spinoza is the first thinker in which ethics and ontology presuppose each other. They operate on the same field. Like an ontological system furnishes a set of ethical premises, and their premises perpetually refer back to their own. The ethical structures perpetually refer back to the ontological background or to the ontological ground. Either way, but the argument there as well is, what Catherine Malabou points out is that Spinoza recognized how important emotion, bodily experience, sensuality, all of these things are for higher order ethical functions. The body, vulgar, base, disgusting, sensual experience is as much a part of substance as, the mind of God, essentially. So that's how she uses. That's where she sees. And you can tie this with Freud in 100 different ways. For Freud, the emotional experience, specifically the partial drives and partial cathexes, which manifest themselves in bodily forms, are also often translated into intellectual manifestations and things. But yes, that's her use of neuroscience to.
Excellent. Since we're mentioning a few names, you can also ask. I mean, I think you've written on Merleau-Ponty too, and certainly I've read essays by Malabou on Merleau-Ponty on phantom limbs and whatnot. She has a great essay which I read recently. But can I ask, just since we're talking about historical figures, where would someone like Merleau-Ponty with his notion of the body come into this equation, this discussion?
Well, I think there's in a slightly orthogonal way, in an awkward way, in fact, because initially you think, Merleau-Ponty's basic contribution was to include the body, the experience of the body within those forms of phenomenological experience, even the forms of phenomenological ontology of Sartre. But what Merleau-Ponty does, which is what I wrote in one of the critiques of Antonio Damasio, which is that, so returning to Damasio, what happens is you have an emotional ground to reason, let's say. Reason emerges because it can assimilate emotion, and if you lose emotion, you lose reason itself. But there's a fantastic portion in the Phenomenology of Perception by Merleau-Ponty, where he argues that he says, imagine like you're watching a film that's been dubbed. So it was, let's say, it was recorded in German, and you're watching it in French or English. And he says that what starts happening is that you're not then like grateful to be hearing it in your language or in your mother tongue. What you start listening for are weird, like the gaps between, let's say, where the mouth is still moving because they'd be speaking in German, but the voice cuts out because the dub is in English, and you watch for the bits of like non-information, and it totally reworks the film, and all you're listening for example, is the moments where the dub and the video, like the audio and the video, simply stop working all of a sudden, and your experience of the film fundamentally changes. It's like the what in the film could be intended to be the most romantic gesture of a renunciation or sacrifice, or a kind of cruel cathartic attack, whatever. Suddenly it doesn't have that emotional token at all anymore. Suddenly what you're watching for is what's missed in the scene, or suddenly, because you're simply hyperfixating on the bad quality of the dub, what you're experiencing directly counters the emotional framework of the film. In the original German, all of the moviegoers might have cried when the main character proposes. They might have been overwhelmed with this kind of like sympathetic emotion. But let's say in the dub, he carries on, his mouth carries on moving in the German, but the English stops speaking. Suddenly it seems pathetic, it seems ridiculous, and you're having a totally. And my argument is that in relation to this, take something like disappointment, or loss, or failure, or joy, euphoria. These emotions are very, very different things for a Stoic, or for a Nietzschean, or for a an anarchist, or for a kind of Schopenhauerian pessimist. These emotional experiences are very different. So my argument is that, in fact, with Merleau-Ponty, yes, you can argue that emotion contributes to reason, of course, but the extension, my argument is that reason also retroactively affects emotion. Like rational frameworks and systems and rational conclusions themselves will reformulate the emotional premise in which they emerge. In the same way that if I have reasoned my way into a kind of into a position of nihilism or kind of naive spiritual optimism, then the news that my dog has passed away will be registered very differently. Even the emotional experience will be a different experience, and this is my argument that he does the right thing, Damasio and Malibu, by entertaining this this split between rationality and emotion needs to be undone. Emotion contributes to rationality. If you lose emotional processing, you, by extension, lose the ability to reason. But my argument is that it needs to be taken much further than that. And what the important argument is that reason itself affects emotion, not just emotion affects reason. It's a two-way street. And once you hit a period, this is also where I see one of my big problems with neuropsychoanalysis, which is that it's clear that at a certain point, like mind itself becomes infinitely beyond biology, beyond brain, and what's important is recognizing the retroaction of certain things upon other things. For example, and John Dall'Aglio, I'll pronounce it terribly, but John Dall'Aglio points this out, which is that yes, we all have something like a hippocampus. So I'm going off target now, but this is like, I'll go back to the thing. Like we all have something
No,
like
please keep going. I had a question on neuropsychoanalysis
yes,
anyway, so this would in fact be a segue. So keep going.
yes. No, but we all have like a hippocampus, which allows kind of rudimentary information and memories to be stored. But humans have a neocortex. Like we have an advanced external brain layer, etc. But the weird paradox is that it's not that like rudimentary memories are then slowly moved out and processed more effectively and more in a more rich way by the neocortex. No, it's that the neocortex has a kind of top down, it can reconstruct more primitive functions. And once you reach the higher modes of cortical rational human processing, they have a retroactive effect on the more basic memory structures, on the more basic primitive forms. And this, I mean, this conclusion part, I don't think they take it because this is also where Lacan becomes extremely important. But even Hegel is clear here, and this isn't a big insight, but for Hegel, like the most important aspect of his logic, and even of his his phenomenology, is that a singular instance revises, it reconstructs the whole or the universal to which it belongs. It begins with the moment substance appears as subject, substance itself is no longer the same thing. The moment for example, the moment an idea, an aesthetic idea, appears in this concrete form, it is no longer the same aesthetic idea. In fact, the very notion, the basic coordinates of an aesthetic idea is retroactively reworked by its particular expression. And if there's one thing here, it's like this, what's called this top-down processing, where the basic evolutionarily older primitive forms of processing, the moment you achieve this higher self-conscious neocortical structure, they have to be like the basic forms of memory processing, the more primitive structures themselves are retroactively forced to adapt to it. And this is a very different so anyway, yeah, I mean, we can go into that more because but
Yeah, I mean, it's so beautifully put, and I should mention here, so the way you conclude this piece, this critique of Damasio, is you say here, and again, this is apropos this, a sensible dichotomy between emotion and reason. You say emotion is a condition of reason that is in turn altered by this very achievement. And so I think that at the end of the day, these arguments you can't capture in like a cogent, like one pithy sense. But this, for me, that conclusion's perfect. It's the perfect way to conclude that piece. And over here, I should mention to the listeners, yeah, if you do want to understand what dialectical thinking is like, just subscribe to Rafael's Substack. In fact, I found Rafael through Substack, and not to blow steam up your ass, mate, but like I think what I really enjoy is kind of thinking with you as you're writing to see how to think dialectically. I mean, one other person that's really done this for me is Adrian Johnston, in a more metaphysical or like more like formal sense, where in fact, correct, he talks about how, yes, the subject, for him at least, emerges from the world of objects. However, the moment the subject emerges, it's almost like it's like a violence done onto reality. But the fact that the subject abstracts away, categorizes as like a cut in reality, and that itself changes reality, and the subject is radically something new. And in fact, this is also now here we're really going off topic here, but this is also Johnston's critique of Zizek's use of quantum mechanics, and he calls him more of a Schellingian, because for Hegel has a Leakage model where, in the stages, subjectivity is something new, whereas Johnston finds this working with quantum mechanics almost like a deflation of the subject, so to speak. Although I feel like I've butchered that argument there. He certainly writes a lot on this, and there's a bit of back and forth between Johnston and Zizek. And one should mention here, He doesn't have the same view when it comes to neuroscience though. With neuroscience is very much like he's even written a book with Catherine Malabou, and he's certainly on board with bringing German idealism in dialogue with neuroscience. Uh, there was I think there was a lot there, but I think as I was saying, this is a perfect segue to delve deeper into your work. But I think we should get a few terms clarified. I think that's important. So at the outset of the conversation, and again, Rafael, just keep in mind this question is going to be coming from a person, let's say hypothetically, who has more of a background in neuroscience or cognitive psychology, and not particularly German idealism. So for a person like that, you mentioned at the outset of the conversation that the thinkers that think best, contradictions, antagonisms, paradoxes, are the German idealists, this philosophical movement that took place in the 18th, 19th, even 20th century in Germany. So, yeah, I don't even know how to ask this question. I mean, how would you, in a very simple way, I know, I mean, there's like a lot to get into here. In a very simple way, how would you articulate or outline how these thinkers capture contradictions best, and then perhaps as a follow-on, if I could say, perhaps why you think that sort of thinking is invaluable for fields like psychology and neuroscience?
Mm. I can. My favorite thing would be here to kind of go through every one and like instances where I think they. I mean, I think what the and I'll go through each one, but I think what they all do, and I think what one of the key uh, uh, like methods of the German idealists, and I mean, I think Kant can be included here as well, which is that you, uh, in fact, I think we included even perhaps the strongest, which is that you define an idea, a concept, a movement, a period, something, not by like average trends, statistical averages, by looking at the middle ground or the median. The way you define it is by looking at the exceptions. Like the way you define it is by looking at what wasn't assimilable to this period, what didn't make sense with this movement, with this notion, uh, whatever it was. What was the thing what was its most extreme manifestation? I think that's how you get at the core to understanding. For example, I mean, I use this all of the time because it still perplexes me. But MAGA communism. Uh, of course, Trump would not endorse MAGA communism, but the MAGA communists endorse Trump, and they are the most ridiculous, extreme form of the new MAGA new form of like nationalistic protectionist globalism, which seems
They're
like a
more
contradiction.
MAGA than even MAGA. Yeah.
Yes, and but that's how you can understand what Trump is doing, in my opinion. You can understand what Trump, because no other populist movement, right-wing populist movement, had this. There's no Bolsonaro or Javier Milei communism. It doesn't make sense. Um, like by looking at the extreme deviations, the thing that doesn't quite fit but still claims to be a moment, that's how you understand. Even like this is the strange thing. It's a part of the thing. MAGA communism is a part of MAGA, but it contradicts MAGA. Like this is how you can understand MAGA. And this is, I think, the logic that's deployed specifically by Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. But to look at, I mean, in a million ways, but to look specifically at instances of contradiction, look, we can begin with the easiest, one of my favorite example, which is Schelling, and Schelling's attempt to, he's often accused, especially, Deleuze was, one of the big proponents of this. He is the kind of bastard child of philosophies of identity. Schelling is there permanently insisting that what we need is to found any Naturphilosophie, any system of natural reasoning, on identity first and foremost. But if you read it, in fact, what he does, and this was I published a paper on this a long time ago, what he does is a truly Deleuzian operation in order to account for it, but even more sophisticated than Deleuze, which is that he asked the question, how can identity precede difference? And he's quickly brought into this kind of Parmenidean impasse. Well, in order to have identity, you need to presuppose difference, but in order to have difference, you need differing things, and these things need to be identical. You're constantly caught between, and as Schelling says, this goes through decades of his work where he's trying to figure this out, from his first speculations on the natura naturalis and being as what is, etc., and then or being as its own like justification, all these things, all the way through to the like 1820s, when he's still asking, like, how can the same be not like the manifold of the same, etc. In other words, like, the question he's asking is, how can identity truly precede difference and not presuppose difference? And he asks this for decades. And then in the Weltalter manuscripts, the Ages of the World manuscripts that were never fully published, he then, in this very beautiful way, completely reframes the problem. And he said it's no longer a question of asking how does. He says we're stuck with this strange contradiction between, on the one hand, the necessity of positing identity as the premise, the first instance of nature, and the impossibility of doing so without simultaneously having it in dialogue, eternal dialogue with difference. And he says, well, first of all, he says that, well, like, he reframes the problem and says this contradiction is itself like a substantial thing. Maybe we begin with a contradiction. And his argument is what he calls the blind act, which we can get onto later on. But the blind act is this rupture in which the logic of identity and difference itself stops, like, is irreducible to identity and difference. Suddenly you have a total formal rupture that brackets identity and difference. It is not outside, but it's like where reason can't attain its own conclusions. And this blind act, this forced decision almost, is a kind of purely manufactured creative excess of God, the thing within God that God can't account for, the außergöttliche Gott, as he used to say, which is a kind of one of his very popular lines. But then, like, God furnishes the very thing as central to himself, like inside himself, that God himself can't account for. And this purely radical act precedes identity and difference, but at the same time, in this very, like, preceding, retroactively posits identity as always having been there. And, like, this mode of deploying contradiction, it's there for, I mean, look, Kant is one of my favorite examples of this. When Kant, it's absolutely clear for Kant that the distinction between phenomena and noumena is you can't traverse it. And in fact, here's one of the points I do very much agree with Slavoj Žižek on, which is when he argues in Less Than Nothing that it's often viewed that Kant takes a purely epistemological approach in his transcendental critiques, which is that we simply can't know. Like, what we have are the premises and the categories that allow for knowledge. We don't know beyond that. And we don't know the thing in itself. And it's often argues that Hegel, on the other hand, is the ontological thinker. Hegel is interested in substantializing this divide, having it be a moment, a temporary manifestation of the concept, or rather, being's negation of itself as it progresses or transitions into becoming, and so forth, into existence, essence, blah, blah, blah. So Hegel is viewed as the ontological thinker. He frames the Kantian distinction within a broader ontological frame, whereas Kant is viewed as the purely epistemological thinker. But Žižek has this great argument. Says no, it's Kant who's the truly ontological dogmatist here, because Kant maintained the absolute necessity of a being out there that cannot be altered, played with, dialecticized, rationalized. Like there is a concrete, determinate being. It's simply out there beyond any of our ability to say anything about it, to do anything with it. Whereas Hegel is constantly playing a kind of game of being is always simply a premise of knowing or being known for andere sein, like existence for the other, or being known for something is always in fact the kernel of being. You don't have being and then it's known. This for otherness, this internal predisposition to be known is what itself allows being to exist. So he constantly relativizes being in relation to its being known. It's being for something outside of being. So he's the one that kind of plays with ontology as a absolutely unessential thing.
Almost plastic.
Yes, precisely. Whereas Kant insists that there is this like thing out there that is being, and we just can't know it. But anyway, Kant maintains this absolute distinction, which seems as obvious. Critique of pure reason, you simply know that the outcome of it essentially is, don't make dogmatic metaphysical claims. And then you have his kind of attempt at making it a kind of ethical principle through pure practical reason. And then the third critique arrives, which to me is my favorite work of Kant's, because here he says, okay, fine, like there are, of course, things you can't know, whatever they are, but you can judge them nevertheless. Like you can and should judge what is nevertheless aesthetically truly unknowable. For example, he gives and my favorite example is what he calls subjective universal judgments, where you have a judgment, for example, of beauty, because he has agreeableness and goodness, he calls determinate judgments. You can categorize them, you can say this is agreeable for me, I don't care what you think, I think it's nice, whatever. Then you can have a judgment of goodness. If you have a precondition for what you call good, then you can say this behavior is good. Very easily done, simple form of judgment. But then you have, he says, beauty and sublimity. Beauty, he argues, has this strange thing where he says that it's of course subjectively judged, but it can't just be agreeable. So in order for it to be called beautiful or judged as beautiful, it would have to be judged as beautiful by everyone. Like it would have to be a universally valid judgment. But Kant admits that you're not going to go around with poll cards to the rest of the population when you're looking at when you're listening to a beautiful like orchestral piece and go, did you like this? Did you like this? And if then like one, if 7,999,000,000 blah 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 agree, but like 3 people didn't agree, then you go, oh, sorry, I guess it's just agreeable. It's not beautiful. Like he obviously says like you don't test it empirically. What you do is you in a certain sense, like impose and insist on your subjective judgment beyond, as he says, beyond a theoretical or conceptual framework. The theoretical and conceptual framework would be you don't know this. It's a epistemological limit. Like you cannot know if it's beautiful universally. But the subjective insistence, the subjective universal judgment, is that, well, this thing is so beautiful, like that it inherently lends itself to be judged as beautiful. It inherently lends itself for me to transgress basic epistemological limits. Like it's almost that it asks me to do it. So the subjective universal judgment is that you take a particular instance, like a particular presentation of something beautiful, and you color the whole with it, like you construct a universal from it. Now, the even more interesting argument comes in his the judgments of sublimity, because beauty, he argues, is like that beauty has this thing where it seems to almost internally presuppose that you will be so overwhelmed by it or so moved by it that you will insist that it is universally beautiful, despite like the clear epistemological contradiction of making such a claim, because it internally predisposes you to make this universal judgment. But sublimity, on the other hand, he says, this is very different. What sublimity does is a direct negation, or a, as he says, a violence to our conceptual apparatus, to our ability to judge. It's almost as if beauty has this Hegelian für andere sein, like it's saying, I exist for you to judge me as universally beautiful, whereas sublimity is almost like a rejection of the position of the observer. It almost acts like this is where it's a Copernican experience, sublimity. Suddenly the world doesn't exist for you anymore. Suddenly, like you're confronted with something that rejects judgment. It is totally inassimilable to your experience. It's a negation of our subjective primacy within the world. It is as if almost substance turns back against subject. And he says, but what we do even here is that we judge it more aggressively and more confidently as such. He says, like, this is the strange tango between a reality that refuses assimilation and a subjective position that claims reality is there for its own observation. So with the judgment of sublimity, you're confronted with something permanently and totally in excess of any conceptual method you have of judging it. As Kant said, it appears as if it rejects being judged, like it refuses, it constitutively is irreducible to judgment. And yet this irreducibility becomes the source of judgment, Kant says. Like we reframe this irreducibility of judgment, or of being judged, as a thing to be judged par excellence. Like we then can even more emphatically kind of affirm and even fetishize this as a sublime experience, this thing that rejected our judgment.
Is it like the notion where I've heard, people say this? I forget who said this. Probably Zizek. The sublime is almost like when you say, "I love you so much I can't put it into words. I have no words to express my love for you." But by that statement itself, you express the love. Is that something like the sublime, the Kantian sublime?
Yeah, I mean, it's more like the Schellingian sublime. There, like slightly more like the Schellingian sublime, which Zizek follows. I think I don't know if that's from Zizek, but there's it's very Lacanian, like the very absence of like an ellipsis, as Lacan writes, like the existence of an ellipsis where nothing is said is in self like the most direct act of speech. Sometimes, or the Freudian argument, sometimes doing nothing is the most profound thing, like the most violent thing you can do. But I mean, we can go back to that. But the point with Kant here is that, like, he's spent two of the first two critiques insisting that we, like, it's essentially like a warning sign: back off. If something is unknowable, do not do anything in relation to it. And then suddenly judgment, and specifically subjective universal judgments of beauty and sublimity, arrive, where like it's as if nature itself says you're just a pathetic little side thing, like you'll never know what really happens in nature. And from this, Kant says we are justified in then judging nature even harder as a consequence. This, and which is a totally perplexing move for the guy who invented the transcendental aesthetic, and the transcendental analytic. He makes the same argument with judgments of teleology. He says making a teleological judgment or teleological rationale, ants get together and do whatever they do to perpetuate the eternal harmony of nature, or something like this. He says this is a nonsense argument. Yeah, it's a teleological argument, but it's nonsense. But still, he says we're absolutely justified in making them. Like, he doesn't say don't make them. He says, in fact, in the absence of a just ground for judgment, judgment itself becomes even more acceptable. we should judge what we cannot know. Now, this movement, and I agree, I like the argument, but I'm saying he takes a contradiction and he simply reframes it as a justification for kind of embodying this contradiction. It's a nice, like almost like Chestertonian move of saying that everything about Christianity is true. Sorry, you can attack Christianity with any stick and the opposite stick. You can attack it for breaking up communities and revealing them to the kind of universal subject of God, and you can attack it for insisting too strongly on communal lifestyle. You can attack it for being a passive religion makes you turn the other cheek, and you can attack it for being one of the most aggressive, destructive forces in world history. It seems like, and this central contradiction is in its service. Like, you simply have to reframe the object, and then you see that this impossibility of a straightforward narrative is not what denies, like what negates this thing. It's in fact what justifies it, what allows us to use it. And I think Kant does this. He does it very well. And I think Fichte and Hegel even more. For Fichte, every instance in which knowing becomes irreducible to its own premises, you simply have a more strong affirmation that reality exists to be known. And I think with Hegel you can give up. I mean, I'm going on a lot with the German idealists, maybe, but I hope the kind of basic premise is there that they are great thinkers of contradiction in the same way. And this is the contradiction, that the functional contradictions that exist in psychoanalysis and in neuroscience, if you know what to do with it, I think. And I say this as a non-neuroscientist myself. I say this as a reader of neuroscience, who I think, because I have an outside perspective, perhaps I'm not, perhaps I'm naive, perhaps I'm an idiot, but perhaps I'm as Tucker Carlson called, Putin called Tucker Carlson a useful idiot in this sense.
Well, I mean, you're not a total idiot, to quote Zizek, because you do in fact give an example here. I mean, you've done your homework, so to speak. You talk about the apropos contradictions, and let's just even call it the gap of subjectivity in the paper, the failed interventions of psychoanalysis. I'll read the whole title: Psychoanalysis and Neuroscience as a Proxy Intervention to Psychoanalysis and Philosophy. You even talk about the executive function in the brain, and how there's this contingency built into it, much like when we see it in psychoanalysis and even German Idealism. But yeah, I can certainly. So I guess first of all, I wasn't expecting you to talk about Kant's third critique. Firstly, I haven't read it, so I can't say much. I've just read like footnotes on it, or just like summaries of it. But I find it so interesting that you connected this question of, perhaps I shouldn't be surprised by this, that you connected this question of contradictions and antagonisms to him talking about the sublime and the third critique. That was beautiful. There was a lot there. One other question which I had, and frankly, at first I felt bad to even ask you this, because I was like, how in the world can I just ask you this in a very crude way and expect you to like come up with an answer out of nowhere? But I feel like from the answers you've given so far, you've given me carte blanche to ask you anything, really. So again, for a neuroscientist or this type of person who's coming more from like a scientific mode of viewing either the brain as being the locus of all of our being and our experience, or even thinking of subjectivity in like a very positivistic sense, who not just people in the sciences, but even I spoke to Graham Harman, and I adore Professor Graham Harman. I mean, I really enjoy reading his work, and he's a fantastic philosopher. But ultimately, I disagree with him because I am a, broadly speaking, a subject-oriented thinker. And for him, even like when I asked him about the surplus in the subject in the Lacanian sense, he kind of started talking about consciousness. But for me, from the reading I've done, when German idealists or even Lacanians talk about the subject, they don't mean consciousness. It's something, in fact, rather, it's almost like a form or a structure, something very formal in a way. But yeah, so
Yes,
if I could ask
for
you,
Lacanian, the subject is
Rafael, yeah, please go ahead.
no, no,
What
sorry,
is the
just a
subject?
brief. The subject is like where consciousness isn't. Like the subject
Yeah,
of Lacan is
he
the
plays with
unconscious.
Descartes' line even. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Sorry, let carry on. I just wanted to. Yes, sorry.
No. You. That's kind of what I wanted to ask from you. Like, I mean, maybe take the Lacanian psychoanalytic angle, but even the German idealist angle, if possible. If someone could just ask you what is a subject, how would you kind of articulate that?
Mm. I mean, I think that the subject is, and I think it's where Graham Harman has troubles here, because, and I think this is the irony with Graham Harman. I totally respect his work. I think he's a very, very, very interesting thinker. Um, he generally is unbelievably good at sort of just summarizing movements very well in philosophy. Um, I always get the suspicion that he simply just isn't very interested in the subject. Like that he's just not, he just doesn't find it that fascinating. He said, what about objects? Which yeah, fine. The more, which I'm like, okay, but this can coexist with subject-oriented philosophy. It's just another guy who says, well, objects are also interesting. Yeah, sure. The more scathing attack is by Quentin Meillassoux. He's the truly scathing attack on subject-oriented philosophy.
Mm.
And yet Meillassoux is, to me, an extremely interesting reader of Hegel. So eventually, even he goes like, "This was a fun attack on correlationism, but sure." Like, and I think even he knows that Hegel can account for the problems of geology, etc. Anyway, uh, relating to the subject, yes, the subject is, if anything, it's where consciousness is not. Um, Animals can be very conscious. I've seen them. We have, and I truly not beyond the, because this is also what Mark Solms often does when he speaks about consciousness, where he says that you begin with like just sensibility on a certain sense, like sentience, etc., and then you get higher consciousness. But he never really goes into the higher consciousness part, in my opinion. Like he'll mention it, but he really, when the like surface is removed, um, he's talking about sensuality and things like this, and uh, but anyway, the point is, I mean, I've noticed with animals, when I say consciousness, I mean like reflective, speculative consciousness. I believe animals have it completely. I'm not a Cartesian in that sense. I believe that the distinction, and I think this is Lacan's main point, the subject emerges with an unconscious. What we have is, we may all animals have a consciousness. What humanity has is an unconscious, because the unconscious is what um, emerges as a consequence of, as an extension from consciousness, from language. It's you enter language and then suddenly you realize language produces effects it can't account for. This is my main problem with, and I'm going to butcher his name as well, but John Dall'Aglio, who the
Dall'Aglio,
Lacanian,
yep.
yeah, the Lacanian neuroscientist, because he begins a lot and says like, well, what's interesting about the mind is like what is in nature and yet in excess of nature. Like, what does nature produce that nature then can't assimilate to? In the same way, what does the brain produce that the brain then can't assimilate to? Like assimilate or like incorporate it according to its own logic. And I think there's two things. Like, on the one hand, you can say like, there's always these. I remember reading the studies that said like the self or the I think is located here in like some anterior part of the frontal cortex, and this is where the self is. Like when you think I am thinking, this part activates. Which then I think, from what I read, none of the studies were replicable. But even if they were, like, fine, there might be a part of the brain that's responsible for the registration that I'm thinking, but what part of the brain is responsible for the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking of the fact that I'm thinking, ad absurdum? Like, you're asking a different question because it might be the same part of the brain, but thinking about the fact that you're thinking is different from thinking, or thinking, you know, like these are different things. So on the one hand, mind is it, permanently in excess of it, but not only this, but also the unconscious. I mean, this is the unconscious is the bit of the development of consciousness that consciousness then can't account for. And this is where Dall'Aglio goes wrong, because he seems to then go, the unconscious is in the Lacanian sense, the real, the non-representable, and the non-representable is simply the intense, like the intensity, the kind of almost overwhelming intensities of basic like drive functions or id functions, as he says, which are basically like the effective registrations of instincts. He argues, not my argument, because I think it's wrong. And then he says, so basically, in a certain sense, the id is the non-representable real, which is, and he says there's a dynamic exchange between neural circuits, but then he goes back and says it's basically in the brain, in the upper brainstem, which to me is totally a mess, because we have to follow what Lacan and Laplanche actually say here. And what Lacan and Laplanche actually say is that not only the id, but the primary function, as it's called in psychoanalysis. So primary function is like basic primitive instincts. Secondary function is conscious, advanced cognitive functions, etc. And what the primary process in Lacan and Laplanche is something that, although it's primary, it comes after the secondary process. So you get first advanced rationality, cognition, consciousness, then you get the thing that's the exception to it. Then you get this kind of unheimlich, uncanny, unpleasant intimacy of an absolute otherness, some type of alien entity within this conscious processing, which is the unconscious. So the seemingly primitive primary process is in fact comes after, it's installed as the exception to a pre-existing, more sophisticated secondary processing. This is totally missed by him, and Lacan insists on this. The real is not what pre-exists, it's the symbolic. The real is the thing produced by the symbolic that the symbolic itself can't account for. It's a contradiction at the heart of the symbolic. But if you remove the symbolic, you no longer have the real either, because it doesn't pre-exist it. Just like the id, and this is crucial for Lacan, the id is simply the counterpart of an obscene superego. Like, if you remove the strange performative customs of the external world, where you're expected to engage with certain performances that make no sense apart from simply perpetuate themselves, the id is the counterpart to this. It's simply the kind of vulgar obscenities nested within social practices, that violent outrage can be justified in accord, if it's permitted by the other, that even, and like to be very vulgar, even rape and murder have a cultural value, like not value as in like they're valuable, but they like their weight, their meaning is culturally inscribed. It's not naturally defined as being rape or murder. It's like it, and in fact sometimes it's culturally encouraged. So the point is, the id as the obscene primitive thing is in fact the logical counterpart to the advanced form of the superego. It's not what pre-exists and resists the superego. It's the kind of, to put it simply, like in a simple literary sense, it's simply the Mr. Hyde to the Jekyll of the superego. It's simply the logical extension of it. Like the superego produces these extremely vulgar intensities that we fight off. So the id, this is my problem with even the Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis, like the id can't be simply something in the brainstem. The id has to be a top-down thing. Like sometimes my brainstem might tell me, you just want to go to sleep, you're tired, you might have eaten a big meal, whatever, you might have walked around a lot in the day, worked hard, you want to go to sleep. My id is the expectation that no, you should also go have some like wild orgies to show that you're living your life or something, or you should be sleeping with your partner or whatever. Like, this is a culturally inscribed logic, and the id sometimes, in fact often, the id, the Freudian and Lacanian id, directly contradicts our biological need. It directly opposes simple survivalist instincts. And It is something where biology acts against itself. So anyway, that's a problem. But returning to the subject, I think the subject is this. It's a way to. It embodies, first of all, a certain lack or an absence, which is, I mean, the simple formula Lacan gives is that the subject is simply what is implied between one signifier and the next, or the one signifier and the chain of signifiers to which it belongs. But at the same time, really, the subject is, and this is my second big point, which is even truer for Marx Holmes, the subject is simply a way of embodying failure. You fail to live up to what you want in childhood, well, then you get the social subject. You don't get the perfect harmony and union with mother, well, then you have the castrated subject that is a social subject, which has an unconscious implication. You don't get a pleasure, well, you learn to enjoy the absence of pleasure. You become a masochistic subject. All desire is masochistic in the Lacanian sense. So like the subject is simply a way of embodying failure. It's a way like you fail to do this. The subject is there to almost symbolize this failure as its own premise, its own form of enjoyment. And this is still the problem with if you read Marx Holmes, it's very, very clear. But even in Lacanian neuropsychoanalysts, which is that it still reduces pleasure to something on the level of need, of this basic homeostatic argument that if you tend away from perfect biological harmony, you feel unpleasure, then you tend to walk back towards it, you feel pleasure. But this isn't, if there's one thing that psychoanalysis insists, it's that pleasure, and specifically enjoyment, is often directly opposed to your Darwinian biological self-interest. Why would you have fetishisms and masochistic, violent masochistic sexual desires if what you're really there for is to have the homeostatic need to drink water, reproduce, eat a meal? Why would you enjoy, almost on an ideological sense, yes, things like asceticism, but also like these strange sexual encounters where the goal of sexuality is postponed endlessly? Like the actual reason you have a sexual relation shows that is postponed. What you have is the continual reproduction of the absence of any sexual relation. You focus on the fetish object. So like human practices, generally ideological, sexual, personal practices, if they show anything, is that enjoyment rejects pleasure. It rejects the basic biological model of survival as pleasurable, homeostatic pleasure. And yet the neuropsychoanalysts insist on it. They tend to insist on, but here's again where you can play with it in a neuropsychoanalytic, in the neurological sense, which is that if the brain does anything, to me, it does many things, but if like memory, take memory for example, if we've seen one thing is that the memory structures of the brain, including the hippocampus, the neocortex, etc., are unfaithful to actual events. They constantly rework each other according to new subjective priorities. It's not creating a faithful representation of the world as it is. It's in fact reworking the world according to strange priorities. And often these priorities can, whatever it can be, they're often very far from survival. You remember a passing glance of a person that you saw on the subway one day, and then suddenly you're totally dissatisfied with any sexual relation. Like memory often can be very counterproductive. It can act against any faithful reproduction of reality and against the basic, survivalist drive: reproduce, have sex, whatever, eat, drink. Sometimes, your memory can be so counterintuitive, counterproductive, that it directly intervenes, like, against these things. And and this to me is, for example, where it should be going, which is to notice that there are these strange enigmas and paradoxes where for example, the basic premise of psychoanalysis that we're not natural, like we're not natural creatures. We're these strangely self-contradictory cultural avatars of failure, of perverse forms of enjoyment. Even the most intimate experience of the self, of my own personality, is conditioned or is guaranteed by the other. It's ideologically structured, etc. Like these are there's no natural experience and things like this. We're not natural creatures. And on the face of it, you'd think, oh, well, that throws neuroscience out the window because neuroscience looks at nature. No, because even neuroscience throws nature out of the window at a certain point, where it says that our memory is simulacral, it reconstructs itself. We operate against biological Darwinian survival. We have strange new priorities once we have a neocortex that directly have a top-down reconfiguration of the earlier, more natural, basic brain structures. So neuroscience itself could reach the same conclusion that we're unnatural. Like the basic human project is unnatural. But instead, it's taken this strange tendency to go, no, pleasure is still, enjoyment is just a reflection of survival. But this clearly isn't the case for psychoanalysis, and my argument would be it's not the case for neuroscience anymore either. Or at least you could push it in that way. We have these strange top-down, perplexing paradoxes that the brain does, which are not faithful to our survival, to a faithful representation of reality. They introduce something different that I think can be used to argue that we're not natural creatures. Our enjoyment is in direct contradiction to pleasure, blah, 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 and so on. I mean, does that make some sense?
But also, as you mentioned in your piece, and I think I was going to ask you about this for you to flesh it out, but I feel like you've already at least intimated the arguments you made in your piece, the enjoyment of failure, a critique of Marx Holmes, this Substack piece, where, of course, you talk about the death drive, and we know that, in fact, for me, really, I get this from. Please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, I get this point from
I'll let you finish, but that's the other point. The Lacanian neuroscientists don't respect the death drive. The death drive is its own thing, and that's very important, even for Lacan. Sorry, that was just a brief interruption.
No, that is in fact quite important, because I had a question on the death drive too. In fact, the last question, and what I was trying to get at here was this. Todd McGovern says one reason psychoanalysis will never really be truly integrated into an institution like a university or a clinic, in a way it has to always break down, is because, well, it speaks of the death drive, it speaks of the unconscious, and the unconscious is something really obscene and ugly, and you can't really institutionalize it like any other field. And that's kind of really what Freud discovered in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle. But look, Rafael, there's a lot here, and I think we need to, in the interest of time, I need to keep my questions succinct and precise. Look, in that piece I was mentioning, your piece, A Critique of Marx Holmes, you do say that the project of neuropsychoanalysis is still a worthwhile project. So, if we take something like what the Ljubljana school tried to do in philosophy, trying to bring into dialogue Lacanian psychoanalysis out of the clinic into sociology, critical theory, and philosophy, German Idealism, really, that was, I'd say, probably one of the most fruitful projects in philosophy in our time, really. It's been unbelievable. It's, frankly, for me, as like an outsider, it's changed my life reading those books, right? So, I mean, I personally, as a very scientifically oriented thinker, like, I can't help myself, I think through the concepts of science, really. I'm seeing how can we save neuropsychoanalysis. So, for instance, when I came across John Dall'Aglio's book, I was, overjoyed. I was like, amazing. There's a Lacanian dealing critically with neuropsychoanalysis. So, if, again, for the listener, if you could probably, perhaps, yes, even steal, I wouldn't even say steal, man, but genuinely try and see what's there to save in neuropsychoanalysis, while at the same time in this piece, perhaps in like a succinct way, outline your critique of Marx Holmes, specifically as he has developed this field so far and where you think the field can go.
Mm. Mm. Well, I think yes, two parts. I mean, I think to rescue the field, you take like most working neuroscientists today, you lock them up, you remove their rights to write anything, and you leave like a few faithful guys behind who can rescue it. No, I'm joking. I'm joking.
I concur. We'll work on that together. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I can think of some nice prisons down in like southern England or something that will. No, but my problem with Marx Holmes is several things, and it extends, in fact, beyond neuroscience. Unfortunately, I'm sure he's a very nice guy, and he's obviously a very intelligent guy. I don't know why he was made responsible for the translation of the standard edition, the new standard edition of the complete works of Freud. As someone who as a reader of Freud, I'm sorry, but he's very rudimentary as a reader of Freud. He makes James Strachey, and James Strachey himself butchered Freud in his famous translations of him. He makes James Strachey seem like a nuanced kind of dialectical reader of Freud. He sees Freud as he views Freud through the simple kind of drive mechanism, the kind of drive structure that we do things we don't want, we stay away from other things we don't want. He essentially fundamentally rejects things like the death drive. But really, also, I mean, he makes some very interesting arguments in. I can't remember the name of the book now. It's the Hidden Spring, the journey to the source of consciousness.
His recent book, yeah.
Yes, he makes this argument at one point where he uses David Chalmers, interestingly, and David Chalmers is quite an interesting analytic philosopher, and he also, and Friston's free principle.
Free energy principle. Yeah, active inference and free energy principle. Yes. Yeah.
And he uses these, but makes a strange argument. Says like, well, how can, and it's his way of solving the hard problem of consciousness. And he argues that he looks firstly at the argument of how David Chalmers solves it, which is that, well, information essentially is never just information. Like any informational unit that is transmitted has this almost internal premise that it is information only once it's registered externally. So it's the inner kind of essence, let's say, or the core of a piece of information is external to the information itself. It's registered as information externally, and at that point becomes information. So because information always presupposes something for which it is information, then basically simply the mass scale buildup of 150 billion neurons simply naturally produces a consciousness that would register its own informational processing. It's just there's no sudden skip to consciousness. And Marx Holmes makes this very strange argument where he initially is very sympathetic to this. In an almost proto-Hegelian way, he says, like, yes, okay, fine, like the movement, like this slow construction of consciousness, I can't agree with, which is very Hegelian, because for Hegel, like, the subject is a rupture at a certain moment of time, like it's an achievement at a certain point, whereas, but he argues that, yes, but I agree that any component thing must be a thing insofar as it's a thing in relation to something else. Carlo Rovelli, the popular scientist, makes the same thing when he tries to solve, he solves things like quantum superpositions by arguing that, well, all information is relational, so there is no thing that is superimposed onto another thing. It's a very strange argument, which also makes me laugh, because I think a lot of these popular scientists like to say, we're leagues ahead of whatever nonsense is going on in philosophy, and yet they seem to have just discovered French structuralism.
Not Color though. I would say he pays great debt to philosophy. I would defend him
Yes, that's
here.
true. That's very true. Yeah, he
Yeah.
does. But in this kind of he does pay great debt to philosophy, but he likes Eastern philosophy. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
in this, like, I'm not opposed to what he
The
says.
mystical kind
The
of philosophy. Yeah,
conclusion,
yeah.
yes, I'm not opposed to his conclusions. Well, I think his anti-essentialism is a bit I don't totally agree with, but the argument that like quantum structures are relational, yeah, of course. I mean, I have no problem with. I think that's an interesting argument, but it always, I don't know, it makes me laugh from the general discourse of neuroscientists that, sorry, quantum physicists that say like we're not doing nonsense here, but really, if you read it, then you go, well, look at this guy, Collo-Rovelli. He's a French structuralist, but he's taken French structuralism to the level of quantum structures and like quantum states, which isn't a problem. Anyway, the point I'm making is that Mark Solms here seems to adopt an almost proto-Hegelian perspective on information, like in consciousness and the constitution of consciousness, where there's no gradual buildup of consciousness, but information does somehow presuppose, like there is a gradual buildup, but in a different way, but consciousness does presuppose in the same way that there's a buildup of substance, and for Hegel, but consciousness does information presupposes the thing for which it's information. But then he makes the argument that, well, we can't truly accept this in our solution because it would imply that consciousness, like that, it would imply some form of panpsychism, that even the smallest, like in amoeba or informational unit, is on some level conscious. And he goes, we can't admit that. So then he seems to return to a very kind of rudimentary notion of Freud, where we have certain adaptive capacities, homeostatic capacities that simply become more and more and more complicated, and this adaptive. And I'm sure, yes, I'm not disagreeing with the argument that at a certain point in time, like organisms existed to adapt to an environment, but humanity is not doing that. And you can't account for the perplexing modes in which consciousness expresses itself self-destructively and all of these things by countering its own logical priorities, by still appealing to the same evolutionary logic. It just doesn't work. It fundamentally obscures what the basic understandings of ideology since, yes, you go back to Hegel, it's there, but really, since the Frankfurt School, since Althusser and all of these people, you've missed, like, we're not evolutionary creatures anymore. And so that's a problem. Now, relating to, you're right, I do believe that neuroscience is neuropsychoanalysis is a very worthwhile field. I think it does something new. But to me, like, the thing that makes the most sense with it is, if you're going to talk about psychoanalysis, then I'm sorry, you need to talk about this, like, serious psychoanalysis, the ones that truly are able to engage with political structures, ideology, interpersonal, intersubjective relationships, romance, love, and even, because you need to ask what is the question that psychoanalysis asks. Psychoanalysis doesn't ask things like what is anxiety and happiness. Psychoanalysis asks what type of subject is capable of these things, which is a very different because it's an ontological question. It's also a phenomenological question, and it's tied to the subject, which is its own sadness, happiness, etc. And in order to answer these, the ones that are answering these questions are Lacan, to a certain extent Laplanche, a certain selective reading of Freud, and a few others. They're the ones that are answering it. So, yes, first of all, you stick with, like, you give whoever the main figures of, you give all the main figures of neuropsychoanalysis a serious, like, they all have to go read Laplanche, first of all. Because Laplanche shows how to read. Like, Laplanche perfectly shows that Freud endlessly vulgarizes himself. He totally obscures his own discoveries. He's a complete idiot in relation to his own genius breakthroughs. So first of all, but then so that would be the first like policy, like just go make them read Laplanche. But then uh, the thing that's the most interesting to me, because then there are Lacanian neuropsychoanalysts, but they don't go far enough. They kind of dilute Lacan. And to me, it's not about finding what type of dynamic, like cortical arrangements allow for symbolic experience. The symbolic is out there. Fine, we register it somehow, but the symbolic is something out there. And it's not about creating a Lacanian meta neuropsychology. Like, that's not going to get us anywhere. In the same way, you can't locate the reversion of essence as the presupposition to its own becoming in the brain. Like, I'm sorry, it's not going to, like the Hegelian doctrine in which being and nothing produces the very thing that is the presupposition for their existence. They produce essence, and yet essence is retroactively posits itself as the presupposition to this being and nothing which produced essence. Strange paradoxical kind of like argument, the famous argument of a thing that posits its own presuppositions. I don't see where you're going to find this in the brain. So like my argument is that it's not about a kind of metapsychological perspective, neurometapsychological perspective, whatever. The argument for me, or at least for now, the thing that I think is worthwhile is to insist on these strange, perplexing contradictions or paradoxes, where neuroscience is based, for example, on the notion that we are, surviving biological creatures, and yet neuroscience is capable of showing where things have gone awry in a certain sense, where the neurocortex suddenly becomes more important than more basic structures. In the same way, Hegel, Schelling, and even Lacan show that, yes, of course, we have a natural origin, we come from nature through evolution, but at a certain point, like something retroactively is undone, and suddenly we're not operating according to the same, like these strange paradoxes where a thing acts like beyond its own premises. Neuroscience is able to do this, and I think psychoanalysis and German idealists are doing it. But I don't know. No, it's very timid, and Dall'Aglio has. Sorry, yes, go ahead.
No, Dall'Aglio has. Please finish
No,
your
so
thought.
he has this at the beginning of one of his. I wish I had the quote with me. At the beginning of one of his papers, he begins with exactly this, or a kind of prototype of this reasoning, and he says, what a neuropsychoanalysis should do, Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis, is not locate, the objectivity is, there, and the symbolic is there, and blah blah blah. Doesn't make sense. What is needed is a patu, as like I call it, a non-all, a totality that is clearly open and doesn't contain itself, and to see where the brain goes in excess of its own confinement. The extra brain thing within the brain, the thing within the brain that goes beyond the brain, in that sense. And I read that and I was like, totally, I completely agree here. Then the rest of the paper, goes on to, in essence, contradict and work against these two basic premises that he began with. So I'm like, obviously the push on a certain level is there, but it seems to undo itself instantly. And I'm like, first of all, localizing it, because even he locates the id in the upper brain stem, which he then says is the real. It's because it's non-representable. I'm sorry, the real is not affect. He seems to be implying the real is something akin to affect. It's not. The real is simply the impasse produced by the symbolic in relation to the symbolic itself. It doesn't pre-exist the symbolic, and it's nothing to do with affect. Well, it's to do with affect, but it's not affect. But like it's, I don't know, learning to, because he does it. You can see he does it, but he seems to be unwilling to follow his conclusion. Maybe he's been, courted by Mark Solms into, like, I don't know, into having some type of dialogue. But a truly, there are, of course, even in Mark Solms's work, plenty of things I agree with that are very good. But the what's important is being instantly obscured. It's like they're repeating Freud. They're going, these are our premises, and instantly forget about them. And if you're, it's about reading. To me, it's reading affinities. You begin with affinities. Like my argument in the failed interventions paper is simply that the multiple demands network, the multiple demands model of the frontal cortex, which shows that there is no seat of executive functioning. There is no portion of the frontal cortex that's responsible for this function or this function, for listening, for social tangos, whatever. No, it's that the frontal cortex itself is just radically contingent. It is its own use. Like there's no frontal cortex neuronal arrangement pre-existing whatever the arrangement is there in order to do. If it's like it is its own use beyond the thing it's used for, it simply is nothing. Like it's an abstract, not an abstraction, but it's a indeterminate kind of formless, mold. The frontal cortex. So the argument of that they make that totally reworked the kind of earlier frontal cortex executive functioning research is that all the frontal cortex is its use. Like all of the neuronal arrangements are totally radically contingent to their use and will entirely rework themselves the moment another task is there. Like there is no permanent set of and then I argued simply, well, this is where we get the Lacanian subject, because the Lacanian subject is nothing but the implication, its own implication within a signifying structure. It is its own use. There is no, it is totally divorced from its own agency. It's simply the guarantee by the other that speech functions. This is where we have the subject. It's a seal of approval almost. It's radically contingent to things that the subject cannot account for to the other. So well, I don't know. This was like a beginning to show that, because this is the thing that neuroscience, that psychoanalysis did with philosophy, which was there is no whole system in which somehow like all philosophical schools would come together under psychoanalysis, and we have a perfect understanding of a whole rational system. What psychoanalysis did was grant a certain validity to, for example, Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel, was to grant, by the logical methods that they deploy, show that they are fundamentally perfectly assimilable to subjective projects, to the paradoxes of self-consciousness and the unconscious. It's not, I used to have these arguments with Sebastian Gardner, the kind of, who was in my opinion, one of the great figures in reopening the case of psychoanalysis in relation to philosophy. But he used to say, I don't know why, in relation to Lacan, I don't know why you're doing this, because, well, there's no unconscious in Hegel's subject. And I said, no, but it's the method in which they deploy paradox, contingency, a certain logic. That's where it's worthwhile, at least for now, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. Beautifully put. In fact, the question I had on this notion of can neuroscience account for the unconscious and the death drive, I think you did touch on that. But I'm cognizant of the time, and I think I'm in no doubt that this warrants a second conversation, and I foresee a conversation soon. It was probably going to be more on your ontology and your critique of Zizek. However, I think we need to continue on this conversation because it's related, this question of death drive. Rafael, what can I say, man? This has been lovely and wonderful. I've learned a lot. I've got to re-listen to it and really absorb it. I'll just ask you this one last, just I guess, concluding question. If you were to articulate a project that can, let's say, scientifically, just leave aside neuroscience, but through the scientific method, account for something like the death drive, do you think that that's a tractable project? Do you think that's even viable, or is that simply untenable?
So, like, if there is a scientific project that can do it, or would it be worth investigating it?
Well, I would probably say both.
Mhm.
I mean, if we are to speak of the death drive, I mean, so far I've seen it beautifully explored philosophically, no doubt. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is like almost using the language of physics, for instance, can we explore the death drive?
Mm,
It's a very highly speculative question. Highly speculative
mm.
question. Do you think I don't know, maybe using something like entropy, for instance, or something? Is that a viable project? Because I always do think to myself like we think of this, because for me, really, the death drive is it's a metaphysical reality, and I do
Mm.
wonder if there's a way to scientifically study it. Perhaps not. Perhaps not. It's just a
Well, I think that I mean I think
fun
that
question to conclude with.
yes. I mean I think I'm I'm sure there's maybe some obscure science somewhere that's I mean in fact I wonder if geology might be the one, because at least geology shows us certain absolute limits to human subjectivity. But no, but I think uh, I mean the short answer is I don't think so. The reason because I'm still faithful, as crazy as Freud's model was, in 1920, the second part of the paper, the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the second part of the first one begins with strange forms of repetition compulsion that are consciously and unconsciously pleasurable, and yet we repeat them. And he says this is where the death drive is. I totally agree. I think the death drive is when you repeat unpleasure to extract some like mediated, discrepant enjoyment out of it. I totally agree. But I'm still faithful to the second part of the paper where he gives this obscure metabiological model of the death drive, where he says like the big accident was life, and all we're doing is trying to basically collectively as a life collective life form undo this horrible accident, which was that we came alive. That's and I think that argument is nonsense. But the argument that the death drive has to be located on a certain level metabiologically, as he says, on a metabiological level, I am faithful to, and I think that just like metaphysics, although physics can be crazier than metaphysics, I don't think you can empirically test metaphysics. I think
Indeed.
this is, and I think in the same way, metabiology, which is where I think I still would locate the death drive, because death drive isn't just excess aggressivity. That's the sort of Kleinian reading of the death drive, and even Zizek says this all the time. It's completely wrong. It's not this very very aggressive tendency that we have. No, it's something way more perplexing. You could it, it, it's a form of totally self-contradictory enjoyment. Where Laplanche is right, the death drive is simply the highest form of sexuality, essentially. But it can only, like, if you take sexuality to its ultimate conclusion, you get the death drive, where you only have sex in order to avoid a sexual relation, in the same way that death is simply sometimes the best way to express yourself in a certain way. And I think and the only form of enjoyment really that's left. And the so in that sense, no, because I think it's a meta biological question.
Indeed,
Um,
indeed. I mean, perhaps I just vulgarized it by even asking you that question, but I was
no,
trying to
no,
be
no.
a good logical positivist. Rafael,
Yeah.
this has been an utter delight. Thank you very much, mate. And as I mentioned, for the listeners, I'll leave all the links to your Substack. But anything else you want to shout out?
No, not at all. No, I'm terrible at self promotion. But thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to be on here and spout some sort of simultaneously pro anti neuropsychoanalytic propaganda.
That's
Uh,
the best way to do it. I mean, my whole podcast is just its reason is just to propagandize.
yeah,
And in fact,
exactly.
I know that you don't like self promotion, but I shall do it for you in the intro, so don't worry about that. But no,
Thank you.
as I was saying to the listeners, for really it just to think with their file and like the kind of how to think dialectically. I've learned a lot by reading your short pieces, and as a dirty utilitarian, I do enjoy the fact that you're very succinct in your pieces. Like it's a quick read, like it's just one session, 15, 20 minutes and I get through it. But again, thanks, Rafael. We'll do it again soon.
Yes, well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to doing it again.